Generals, dear colleagues, I'm not Andreas Werner, and it's definitely not my presentation. Andreas handed me over a CD yesterday late in the afternoon before he ran away, and now, as you heard, hopefully he's holding a newborn baby and a happy mother in his arms, so he won't even regret not to be here. And you will understand that. There's a story to this presentation which reaches back about 2 years. I spent quite some nights in the lab looking for vigilance tests which you could use in training to demonstrate how you get fatigued and then to demonstrate how countermeasures set in. So I spent the nights there and I got fatigued and I did my tests and my eyes burned and my mood went down, and at that time I didn't drink coffee. So I was abstinent from caffeine, and then one night I was really down. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I started asking myself, why am I here? Why the hell am I here? Why am I doing this? What is this for? This doesn't lead to anything. And then I took a tablet of caffeine, 200 milligrams, and I chewed it, and it was bitter, and well, it only took about 10 minutes, and then the effect kicked in. And that was great. Caffeine is a great pharmaceutical, and since then I'm very much convinced, yeah, wait a minute, it's not that easy. And I got interested in caffeine at that time, and I started reading a little bit, but I didn't have enough time. And so when Saskia last September called for papers, I remember, yeah, I'd like to learn more about caffeine. Why not tell her that Andreas is going to do a presentation about caffeine? So first I told Saskia, Andreas is going to give a presentation, and then I asked Andreas, please do this presentation about caffeine and all the background. I want to learn about it. Now here I am giving his presentation, and you know, I first was a clinician and I'm now more of an administrator. And Andreas, he is a scientist, so he really goes deep into it, and you'll see the slides. I'd like to ask you, help me walk through these slides to come. Okay, we'll start. It's about caffeine as a promoter of wakefulness. And we first look, that starts easy. Next slide, please. We look at the circadian rhythms, and you see their coordination and reaction time. So there is a rhythm to cognitive skills. Next, please. And he first of all asked very basic questions. What's the state of wakefulness? It's characterized by consciousness, the ability to evaluate ourselves and to stay in contact with our surroundings. And you have the full cortical reactivity of your brain. Next slide. And fatigue, contrary to that, is characterized by a reduction of consciousness, not loss, but the reduction. And the ability to evaluate ourselves and the surroundings is going down, is decreasing from the optimal level, and we have decreasing cortical reactivity. And then, of course, next slide, there is sleep, characterized by a lack of consciousness. And the ability to evaluate ourselves is shut down, although sometimes you can reason even during dreaming. Losing contact with the surrounding reality and decreased cortical reactivity. And the next slide shows the overall cortical reactivity, as you can see it in the EEG. You can differentiate different states of consciousness electrophysiologically. There are distinguishable 5 levels of wakefulness or consciousness, and these stages alter in the rhythm of consciousness throughout the 24-hour circle. This activity represents the electrophysiological activity of millions of neurons, so it's a very global view on wakefulness and fatigue. But there is a different level. Next slide, please. There is the adenosinergic system, which plays a major role in the rhythm of consciousness. And the players of these systems are ATP, the major energy delivery to the cells, especially the brain cells. There's adenosine and the adenosine receptors. And keep in mind the adenosine receptors, they play a very important role together with the caffeine later on. Next slide, please. And now it's starting to get more complicated with this system. Adenosine, well, look to the right-hand side. Adenosine is in the center. It's a keystone of the logistics of energy in the brain. So it plays a very important role. And adenosine reacts with different types of receptors to make things more complicated. Next slide, please. Adenosine has a function in the brain to support the restoration of energy. And so adenosine is a sleep promoter, because sleep is a state where the energy in the cells is restored. And in this role as sleep promoter, adenosine reacts with the A1 receptor. And the more receptors are occupied by adenosine, the so-called sleep pressure, the pressure to fall asleep, to produce all the symptoms of fatigue, of sleepiness, this sleep pressure increases the more adenosine reacts with its A1 receptors. Next slide, please. Adenosine is a sleep promotion agent. It's a physiological molecule. It works mainly in the central nervous system, and it's inhibitory, neuromodulating. It blocks especially the stimulating neurotransmitters dopamine, acetylcholine, and noradrenaline. And so it's a sleep-promoting molecule. So the more adenosine is there, the more you feel the symptoms of fatigue. Okay, next slide, please. Please forget the left-hand side. Concentrate on the right-hand side. With prolonged waking periods, your adenosine levels are increasing, and during recovery times, the adenosine levels are going down, and so, of course, the reaction of the adenosine with its receptors is congruent to that. Next slide, please. That again shows the correlation, or the inverse correlation between the ATP, the energy providers, and the adenosine. So during alertness, you have high levels of ATP and adenosine is low, and during fatigue, increasing fatigue, adenosine levels are increasing. And the next slide shows exactly the same. And I don't know why he put it as a hypothesis. I guess literature doesn't support it fully, but it's very plausible from what we know. Next slide. Yeah, of course, he's a scientist. Next slide, please. Next. Yeah. He's a scientist and he goes deep into the matter, and so there we are in the rat brain, nothing to do with humans, or perhaps yes. Sleep deprivation, again, sleep deprivation leads to increasing levels of adenosine and decrease in ATP. So the main message is if you are talking about adenosine, you are at the very core of energy management on the cellular level. Next slide, even more complicated, and I need even more help to understand it. That's brain activity, electrophysiological activity, and the more fatigue there is, the lower the ATP level gets. So it's again the proof of what was already said before. Okay, I think we've heard enough now about the adenosinergic system. Yeah, I see nodding. Thank you. So next slide, please. We're facing in on the main subject, the caffeine. How does it kick in? Caffeine is a known countermeasure to fatigue, and caffeine is a pharmaceutical which is widely used throughout the world in enormous quantities. That's just to recall all you already know about caffeine. Next slides. It's a stimulant to the central nervous system and to metabolic pathways. It's used recreationally and medically to reduce physical fatigue. And it restores mental alertness when unusual weakness or drowsiness occurs. It first sorry. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay, I won't read it again. Once in the body, it has a very complex chemistry. It reacts as caffeine, but it also has a metabolism, and it has active metabolites. Next slide, please. Again, effects of caffeine, you well know. It not just reacts in the central nervous system, but it reacts throughout the body. And that's a reason for problems. If you try to increase the effect of caffeine to the brain, you can do that, and it works. But the higher the dosage is, the more adverse effects throughout the body you get. And so there is a limitation for increasing the dosage. And of course, there are symptoms of overdosing caffeine. But with regard to the central nervous system, it's a very potent anti-sleep drug. I already mentioned the caffeine metabolism. Next slide, please. It's metabolized over the liver. It's once ingested, completely absorbed by the stomach and small intestine, mainly small intestine, within 45 minutes. But first effects kick in much earlier than 45 minutes. After 45 minutes, it's ingested totally. First effects already after 5 to 10 minutes. The half time, and that's a problem when using it in an operational context, the half time varies widely among individuals, among situations, with regard to your circadian rhythm, and especially with regard to your normal caffeine consumption. Next slide, still metabolism. Yeah, that goes deep into the theory. Yeah, as I already mentioned, there are different metabolites which are active themselves, and they too have effects on the entire body, which you have to take into account. If you're interested in formulas, the next slide will give you some color. Yeah, doesn't help us very much with our main subject, so we'll go on. Next slide, please. Yeah, in healthy adults, the half-life of caffeine is only 3 to 4 hours. So you have a very rapid decrease of the concentration, and that asks, if you want to use it for sustained operations, you have to add doses after a couple of hours, and you can't predict very well how the individual reacts. On the other hand, caffeine can accumulate, so it's very hard to give advice what a specific individual should take and in which intervals. So for operational reasons, that tells us everyone should know how he or she individually reacts to different doses and to different regimens in administering repeated doses. Next slide, please. Some of the effects of caffeine not so well known. It has a decreased sleep latency. It shortens the total sleep time, so this isn't quite an advantage because you need your sleep to restore your energy stores. And it leads to sleep fragmentation, so your sleep isn't that healthy as it could be. And if you take into account all that, you should be, I think, careful with the use of caffeine, especially with the repeated use of caffeine and the day-to-day use of caffeine. Because it really induces long-term effects on your sleep quality, and so reduces the positive effects of your sleep. Next slide, please. And now we bring together the adenosine and the caffeine. Although I'm not a chemist, so the molecular structure doesn't tell me that much about their relation they have. But in the next slide, which is very busy, there you can see where the effect of the caffeine comes from. Caffeine competes with adenosine for the receptors. So caffeine makes sure that not all of the adenosine can react with the receptors, and so the sleep evoking effects of adenosine go down and you stay more alert. But on the other hand, and that's not on the slide, adenosine competes for the receptor with the caffeine. You could say if caffeine reacts with that receptor, it's a caffeine receptor. And then the adenosine competes with the caffeine, and the body reacts, the cell reacts. It produces, within only hours, it produces more receptors. And that's the reason why you become tolerant to caffeine. And if you use caffeine day to day, drink your morning coffee, drink coffee throughout the day, the effect you cause is that this system adjusts on a different level. You will have more many more receptors for caffeine or adenosine. And so the adenosine can cause its sleepiness effects again, and you need more caffeine to produce the same effects of wakefulness. So if you drink coffee regularly, you're really messing with that system. And I think that's one of the main take-home messages of this presentation. That's a complex system, and if you use caffeine regularly, you're doing something to that system. And this system adjusts to what you are doing. Next slide. It goes a bit back and forth. Caffeine, the psychomotor vigilance task was taken as a method to measure reaction times. And reaction time is increasing, especially if you are sleep deprived in consecutive days. And caffeine is mitigating that effect. So reaction time doesn't go up that much if you take caffeine. Next slide, please. Oh, I see not caffeine is taking effect in the audience, it's more the adenosine. Yeah, caffeine, it's not that simple. Individuals react differently. There are different types with regard to sensitivity for caffeine. And that again, if you want to use it in an operational context, is a strong argument that the individual has to know how it reacts individually. Next slide. Caffeine is a legal drug. It's a very potent drug. If you abstain from it for a couple of days, then its effect kicks in very nicely. It's a legal drug. That means it's not a pharmaceutical, so you can experiment with it more freely than you could with a real pharmaceutical. And so it's easier to experiment with, easier to do operations-oriented research. For example, you don't have to use pills of caffeine to experiment with, but you can do standardized preparations of coffee. Just measure your water and the coffee, make sure you always take the same brand, the same lot, and then you can produce standardized coffee. And if you have access to a toxicologist, as we have in our institute, you can measure the blood levels you reach, and you can do a lot of very nice research, not being impeded by too much legal restrictions, because it's not a pharmaceutical. Please keep in mind it has a tolerance effect. And this tolerance effect is due to its being deeply embedded in the cellular energy cycles, and especially this competence for the receptor of the adenosine, and the receptors react if you start to mess around with them. And then, of course, next slide, as all scientists do, you should do further studies, and you can do further studies. We're looking forward to do further studies. That's a short glance into our future. Our Institute of Aviation Medicine, which is located close to Munich, many of you know, is going to move to Cologne in the years to come. And we're not just moving, we are merging with the Office of the Surgeon General of German Air Force, so getting stronger. And we're moving to Cologne, not just to the city of Cologne, but to a very special place. We move to the campus of the German Centers of Air and Space, and they've got an Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine. Our new building will be neighboring to their building, and so common research and cooperation will be facilitated. We are looking forward to create a national center of aviation and space research. And just by chance, the director of the Civilian Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine, Professor Gläser, he's a clinical pharmacologist. And for years, he's carrying the idea with him to create a white list of pharmaceuticals which can be used by aircrew without thinking too much, because it's proven that they are safe. So he is very interested in such pharmaceuticals, and our first main project in pharmaceuticals will be looking deeper into caffeine, its effects, and how it can be used in operational contexts. So, thank you very much for your patience. This ends Andreas' presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much.